The whole intuitive training concept evolved so rapidly for me because working with RTS, obviously at the beginning, and I apologize for those listening. I'm hoping I'm not like throwing RTS under the bus. It's just RTS was like, I think the pioneer or whatever you want to say in both like implementing RPE into training and then expanding that a little bit further to like introducing like load drops and fatigue percentages to allow for auto-regulation and helping athletes like truly find the dose that works for them. And when I first got into powerlifting, like truly, I was already on board with that like right away. Like once I realized I wanted to evolve from like a 5-3-1 program to something for me, everything else just seemed like someone else's version of 5-3-1. You know, it's like, well, actually, my method is better. Like the Mad Cow is better, or I don't even know what there is now. Like I heard like GZCPL or something. I don't know.
I did PH3 back in the day. That was a fun one.
Yeah, with PH3, it's like, well, this one's evidence-based. And so like hypothetically based on this study, you know, squat, bench, and deadlift every day is actually the best. And RTS was kind of communicating like, actually, you can adjust the volume and the intensity on any day and probably get a better response from that. And it seems like almost the entire powerlifting industry, including RTS, at least in their public facing way, have moved away from the kind of session to session auto regulation or, you know, manipulation of training variables, because that's, I think, really what it is. And then I saw your post on Instagram. Well, I was like talking to Tyson and Mike, and they're like, yeah, I just go in the gym, I hit something really hard, I hit another thing really hard based on how I feel on the day, and then I move on. And I'm like, coming from like this emerging strategies background that is somewhat auto-regulated, but only really with load because of the whole idea about like signal to noise ratio, which I'll talk about later. Right. And then they're telling me that they both are just showing up to the gym, and it sounded like doing random stuff. But as I learned more about it, at least like their process, and we've evolved it even further since the original podcast that we had, it seems like it's actually just really bringing awareness to like their body and their mind in alignment with the overall goal, looking at like the space of the gym and according to their objectives, like what would be the best thing to do for the day. So that's kind of the overview of where I'm at with it. I'm curious if you've had a similar journey, or like, have you always been kind of promoting the autoregulative practices and training?
Man, that's a tough question. So we're coming out swinging. So basically,
always. Never not autoregulated.
For sure. I started out probably similar to you, right? Like everything, you know, program, blah, blah, blah. And then you learn about autoregulation. We start to kind of layer that in. And I will say, I still do believe in at least some degree of consistency, whatever is available within the broader scope of your lifestyle and what's going on, right? And I think programs are super, super helpful, just the organization structure, and you can time things out, you know, whatever. But the intuition part, that like how your body feels while you're doing it, is so important. And that has, in my opinion, has to be integrated into that to at least some degree, right? And I think different people, you know, we can talk about those too. Like there's differences, right? Some people, I think, like it sounds like from the older podcast that you guys did, especially Tyson, was just like very in that intuitive, like that's it, right? And I don't know if he's still like that or what, but there's like that side of the spectrum. And then there's, you know, just it's not quite there today, let me drop the load a little bit to hit RPE 7 or whatever, right? So different people, I think, can be different places in that spectrum. And I've just sort of come to this, like, my general baseline, I think, currently is using intuition to modify a program and try to get to a program that is the most individualized ultimately. But then depending on what else is going on outside the gym, sometimes we got to throw that out the window and do some other stuff and just really lean into that intuition. So that's sort of where I'm at now. And I think getting there has just sort of been like my own personal lifting experience, journey, whatever word we want to use. And then just working with a bunch of people and seeing, you know, some people, like, they're a student and that's all they got going on, super stress-free life. They can always hit the gym the same time, the same days, whatever. Awesome. Other people, it's not like that, right? So
Yeah,
we got to account for that.
I think as like the longer I work with athletes, I mean, the average age of the athlete that I work with is getting older, or maybe it's always been older. Because I mean, I worked with RTS, like there's not a lot of college kids at the time that were like Team RTS. It was very much like older. It was like 25 to honestly like 70, but everyone was pretty much bought into that idea of like, I need to find what's best for me. And we provided at the time various frameworks for doing that. But now it's like, it's not about like the strategy of like the protocols or whatever. I mean, it is, but the intuition isn't just load and volume.
Right.
And that's like very new for me, because
Same.
what about what about the signal and the noise? Like, isn't it so hard to tell like how what are we observing then as a coach if they're doing something different all the time? And I've had a lot of thoughts about that, but the more I lean into it, this even harder as a coach, it's like I need to educate the athlete enough so that they have the tools available to make these decisions on their own within the program that we write. Or I do have some athletes, and we only do this for like a block or two. I'm like, look, I've been running your programs for 3 years. You know, you have probably a good idea of what I would recommend in any given situation. I want to learn more about what you would do in these situations using the framework that we've been building over time. And I want to see what happens, because some lifters, it's very easy for them to do that. Other lifters are like, wait, what? You're not going to write me a program? And I'm like, well, you have the objectives, you have the goals, you know, the movements that we've done, but you know, there's education that kind of comes with all of this for 3 years. Eventually you're going to talk about some of the things that explain why you're doing what you're doing. So I've run that a few times with some of my athletes, and like some people, they love it for a while, and they're like, okay, but now I have now I have a meet coming up, and I do want a template to modify, like you mentioned. Like I want to follow, now that I have like increased autonomy, I want to give it back to you a little bit, so then I can find that autonomy in other places. Have you experienced? I mean, have you ever experienced with that yourself, or with your athletes, like kind of just going free willy with it?
For sure. It hasn't been a ton, to be like with clients. It hasn't been a ton. There's certainly been some situations, and it's usually because like just other external variables are so crazy that like the thought of having a program is stressful. And like, I don't want you to stop lifting. So if what it takes for you to keep doing something is to just say, today, I'm just going to go into the gym and do something fun, right? Like, sweet, right? If that's what it takes to keep some level of consistency, I'm down. I've done that a ton myself over the last couple of years, right? And I think that it's certainly not a bad thing. Is it sustainable? I'm not sure. Sustainable, obviously, in the sense of it's enjoyable and whatnot, like, of course, but sustainable in the sense of like, can we rely on that leading to the best outcomes in the longer term or even in the moderate term? And like you said, if someone's like, hey, there's a meet in 16 weeks that I want to do, I don't know, right? Like, to me, my intuition is to be like, all right, let's at least rein things in, you know, even if it's just the main lifts, right? If you want to, whatever, like I've had that before, you know, somebody, you know, maybe all the squat, bench, and deadlift stuff, and some of the like bigger accessories, quote unquote, like any kind of hip hinge stuff, even sometimes like back movements, like at least in terms of like horizontal, like rowing or whatever, right? I'll at least give some direction on those kinds of things too. But then I'm like, do whatever you want for your arms. Be careful with triceps, but like you want to do some bicep, a little bit lateral raises, whatever, go to town. Calf raises, that's fine. So finding like a middle ground in that situation, I think, can be helpful.
Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah,
there's like another, like, I'm gonna try to peel as many layers as possible, because going down this rabbit hole has really like fundamentally shifted like how I perceive my role as a coach. How do we prepare for a meet at all? I mean, like you mentioned, there are these like ways that we can get them there, but then coming from like the emerging strategies background, we were very much reliant on like this concept of time to peak. And, you know, after a certain number of exposures to, I don't know, the main lift, the athlete is supposed to kind of have a predictable peak performance. But as the like world has become, I don't know if it's just always been this way or I'm just noticing it now because I have my attention on it. The reliability of that, it seems much less the more and more that I've implemented. I mean, I don't force athletes to be like, you don't peak in 5 weeks. That's not a thing. But it's more like we kind of went away from how do we even respond to training. Like, I feel like it really blurred the line of what is it that we're achieving in this training session today? And then how does that impact tomorrow's session? And I got, over time, like, I had a lot more questions, because if we're supposed to just rely on this like block stress or this microcycle stress to like guide us through to the peak, but then you don't sleep well for like one night or 5 nights and your performance dips, and then you're like microanalyzing that because now you think you're like a type 4 responder or something. And you're like trying to fit yourself in this box because like the outline is like, well, you're type 1, 2, or 3. And I get that that's like what the point was. It's just an outline and you got to find your way within it. But I think people like to attach themselves and identify with certain things so that they can view themselves in the world a bit better. But with an intuitive process, it's like, it really flips that on its head, because now it's like on a session to session basis, like what do we need to do today so that tomorrow's session feels better, or so that the meet goes well. And I've loved it much better because it's less magical. It's much more like, hey, how do you feel right now? Do you think we need to do the plan? Like, I have a lifter preparing for Bench Worlds, and Sunday she benched and she's like, hey, my upper back was kind of sore, but I hit a PR on feet up bench, so I'm really happy. And I said, okay, cool. Like, do you think we are still good to go on like the plan that we wrote out for this week for the taper? And she's like, yeah, actually, I think it's going to be good. Like, you can still visualize and plan, but then like by asking her questions about how she's experiencing the session and whether or not that session will impact the later sessions, you know, that shapes how we end up thinking about what peaking is, instead of like this magical event that happens like it's peaking time, you know?
Right. For sure.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that so I have a very, it's a Google Doc or a Google Sheets, I guess, technically, that when you first look at it, it's very stressful. And I'm just like, what is going on here? But like, because I've used it for so long, it's like, it's fine. Right. It's just if you haven't seen it, I had Zach actually saw it one day and he was just like, what is that? Cause it's all color coded and it's crazy. Right. But basically what it is whenever I start working with somebody, then from that point on, every week, I'm kind of tracking roughly what it is, right? Like, is it a heavy week? Is it a deload week? Is it a hypertrophy block? Is it whatever, right? So now I can kind of look back whenever there's a meet on the horizon, I can look back and see, you know, based on that, all of this prior data that we have and it's all organized by week. And like, there was a meet here, and it's just an easy way to look at it.
Yeah.
That, I stole this from Pascal from Revive Stronger, so I should give credit to him. But, it just makes it nice to see those timelines, right? And you can see like, you can leave notes like this time they felt peaked here. This was sort of what was going on. A different meet, they felt way too beat up. Oh, wow. Super stressed at school and work, and they moved and their girlfriend broke up with them and they didn't sleep, like all this, right? So like, it's nice to have all those things so I can compare them. I found that to be really helpful. And then the other thing I always tell myself is that like, everything's written in pencil. Like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, okay, this is the plan no matter what. It's always getting that feedback from the lifter. Like you said, I think that's a beautiful way to do it, right? Is just asking them questions. How did this feel? Like, it doesn't, the data itself matters. The spreadsheet is great, whatever, but getting that subjective feedback too of like, what did this feel like for you? Do you feel confident in doing another week, etc.? I think that's really helpful.
Each like segment I record, so we didn't lose anything. Well, we lost whatever you were saying that probably.
Okay.
Any idea where we lost connection?
Something, I think we were talking about the time to peak stuff and and how like intuition can play a part in that and whatnot. So I think we lost the connection somewhere in the middle of my thing. So let me just jump into what I was saying again, I guess, and then I'm sure you can clip this together, however it makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think basically what I was saying is I like to keep track of everybody's timeline, right? So like everyone that I'm working with when we start, I'm starting to map everything out week to week, what kind of block it is, whether it was a hard training, normal training week, whatever, or a deload week, or etc. So it's helpful to like be able to look back on those things and see not just the timing of certain blocks or certain peaks, but the circumstances around it, right? Like you can leave notes and stuff, so like maybe one time it was perfect and it was XYZ circumstances. Another time it wasn't perfect and it was XYZ circumstances. And like that right there to me is an immediate example of like, we have to be more fluid with this kind of stuff, right? Like, I think that if all other external variables were held stable, then I think that we could have a lot of confidence in like, okay, it's probably pretty similar time, peak to peak, whatever. But like, that just doesn't happen very often, man. It feels like every meet prep's a little bit different. And not even meet prep, it could just be, going up for a test day or whatever. They're often not quite the same, right? And all that stuff impacts it, like you were saying, sometimes like it's going really well, but something feels a little bit funny, but overall everything is great. And the athlete still feels super confident about, sticking with the original plan. Other times you get that feedback and it's like, dude, I don't know. Like, like they're just kind of, I think that confidence is such a huge piece too, right? Getting that feedback week to week, especially in those heaviest training weeks. And like, do you know for sure that you feel really confident for next week? If yes, sweet, we'll do it. If not, maybe we should at least consider changing something, right? Not that we have to change it, but we should at least talk about it.
Yeah.
And that like you were saying, just that feedback and literally asking people questions. How did this feel? Like it's such a vital, important step. Like you got to do it. You got to do it.
One of the things that I love doing, like, and thinking about when it comes to coaching is like my role or my goal is like, at some point, you've learned as much as you can from me, because eventually I might stop learning. I don't know. Maybe I'll never stop learning probably, but like, you work with an athlete for 4 years, like there's no more of that like magic.
Right.
Like, when you start working with someone like, oh, everything's going to be so good. And maybe it is, but then like a bad meet happens. And then like, hopefully you're working with people that are, mature enough to realize that like your coach isn't going to solve all of the problems, but hopefully you can work together to like build up your relationship with lifting and all of the things that impact training. So like on the block reviews or like our weekly, monthly calls that I have with clients, I if they're already there with me, like if I'm able to just start jumping into talking about like the biopsychosocial model or something, and how that impacts an athlete's session to session performance and their decision and like the value of motivation and all the factors that impact motivation, you just dig deeper and deeper and deeper. But like what I try to do now is just kind of like jump in as soon as I can. And if they don't understand anything, that's fine. I'm still gonna write a program and they're still gonna like probably follow it. And then like eventually the puzzle pieces start going like this, and I think that's like the goal, is to take an athlete where you have a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty, and you might not ever get to a point of like certainty, but hopefully you can provide them and like nourish them with the right education and systems and tools and actual experience to build up their intuition about themselves to a point where they have a pretty good idea of what they can do to adjust the program when I'm on the other side of the world and I'm still in bed, you know,
Yep.
and to get a productive response from that. And so one of the other things that I've added onto this intuitive training, because like I think when you talked about the spectrum of like you might be fully intuitive, like no program, like I think it's just intuition is going to drive the decisions, whether or not you have like a template or a program or whatever. But if you leverage a lot of your intuition, then your autonomy to make a lot of adjustments is usually a lot higher. If you have a little bit less like intuition about what works, then maybe there's a lot more collaboration between you and the coach until like you test enough things and more or less situations, you have a good idea of what has to happen to keep moving. And I developed this thing like yesterday. It's not really like a thing. It's more of an idea. I'm going to try to share it because it's really funny because I don't know how to draw.
Okay.
But I've found it to be quite useful in helping people visualize. I have to find it. It's basically, long story short, it's called the triangle method.
Okay.
And I only did it because I think it's like funny that everything has to be like a method.
I was just going to say that it's something method always.
Yeah, but it's not like actually a method. It's more of like a process to teach or to help an athlete understand how and for those who are listening, this is going to be on YouTube, so you can watch this part on YouTube, but I'll try to use words, and I also have to figure out how to like use OneNote. Okay, so we have like the athlete in the center of the triangle, right? And we also have more or less the biopsychosocial model as a framework to help us like understand how any stimulus or any task may influence the athlete's response, drive, motivation, etc., to perform and respond. So I think about something like, let's just say we think that the athlete has expressed that their goal is to improve their squat, or more specifically, they want to improve their 1 rep max squat at a competition. And if we just like take that goal of, I want to improve my squat. Okay, so that's like a biological, kind of biomechanical, like based objective that's influenced by, well, their own current biology, and then their like future biology, like what other structural and tissue adaptations that they make. But then their ability to do that is influenced by their psychology and their sociological relationship to like that experience as well. And this is probably like more complicated than, actually, I think it's as complicated as necessary, because if you really want to use intuition, at least this is my perspective, you have to really dig deeper to how is the athlete responding today and why? Not just, oh, well, when we did 2 count pause squats, they responded well. I find this to be a much more, it is harder. Like I couldn't do this for like 60 athletes. Like, you know, it's a lot of thought processes, but I could teach this to 60 athletes to do themselves or to think about it from themselves. So again, going back to the squat idea, like maybe they train at a powerlifting gym, right? And they have all the best equipment and kilo plates and everything. So maybe they give some points or some like benefit from the sociological perspective. However, like the program that we're performing is making them feel like an outcast because no one else is doing sets of 7 2 weeks out or something like that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so unless my relationship with them is strong enough where they really don't have as much of like they're not influenced by their peers, that might impact their ability to put everything into the training. So that's just like, you probably can't see this very well, huh?
You're good.
Right. So like that influences their psychology, but also their psychology influences their response to the sociological relationship to the experience of squatting and performing whatever protocol the lifter is doing. But it's hard for us to know, which is why it's important to share, because I'm not there with them at the gym. But I think you can ask questions about that if you frame it right. And I think a lot of coaches might not have the tools to ask those questions. Like, is it okay to ask them like how they feel about doing a set of 7? Aren't I supposed to know if 7s are the best protocol? Like, you know?
Yeah. Yep.
And the more and more I think about that kind of idea, I get less and less comfortable being certain about the definitive training program for any athlete that works with me. Right. So like, this is just like a very funny like model, but the triangle method is basically like a way to implement the biopsychosocial model into like every decision. Because you could do the same thing for like the squat, you could do the same thing for the rep range, you could do the same thing for the frequency, for whatever. And it always kind of, you don't have to go that deep, but if you go with these three things, and then you might have some uncertainties still, but it's much better than like looking at a training log and seeing like that, you know what I mean?
For sure.
And then I feel like it helps the athlete understand themselves even better than just like, well, when I do 2 count pod squats, I get better. I don't know, I keep saying that, but you know what I mean? Like it's
for sure. It's the why. It's always the why.
Yeah. And knowing how many things impact the why is the one thing that why I've been like falling in love with this intuitive training thing.
Yeah, dude. Man, I'm trying to decide where to start. So one, I think the first thing I want to say is I think it's a really, really great way to think of it. Really good model or method.
Yeah. It's a method.
You could just screenshot that, put it on your website right now, man. You're ready to go. Yeah. But I think that that's what you're getting at, right? Like, I think that a misconception is almost like a caricature of what you're actually talking about is that you just do what you feel like doing. And it's like, no, dude, that's not like, we need to get information on how you feel about the thing, but like, it's not purely guided on that. So I think that's a huge,
just emotions.
Just emotions. That's
it. Yeah.
So I think that's first and foremost. I just want to make sure that like I want to underscore that because I think that's huge. And then second, I feel like so much of that has become my like troubleshooting process. Not that like obviously data is still helpful. Like, you know, you look through the spreadsheet, you can get some, even if it's kind of messy, you can get some idea of what's going on. And that's a piece of the puzzle, right? But when you're troubleshooting something that's not going well, it's like, I have these numbers. I know whatever sets you did, the RPE, whatever, but like, why was it all of a sudden an RPE 9 instead of a 5? Like, there's a reason. It's not that it just stopped working. You know what I mean? So like, going through those 3 different points, like you were saying, just, it helps you ask those questions, right? And helps the athlete reflect and think about those things. And that's become a huge part of the process for me is like, I'll have somebody who, and for whatever reason, I don't know how we've managed to attract a fair number of these kind of people, but a lot of times I'll have somebody, if something didn't go well, it's usually like, if it was 1 week, they're like, yeah, this didn't feel great, but I'm not super worried. We'll see how it goes next week. I'm like, oh, sweet. Like, it's a good perspective, right? Maybe it was just an off day. But then if it's like a trend, then usually people aren't just like, it's not working and frustrated. Like, almost always they automatically start that reflection process on their own. Like, beautiful, right? And I think that as the coach, a huge part of what we should be doing is encouraging that and helping, like, not just asking them questions, but helping them ask themselves questions and help, because that gets to what you were talking about earlier, right? About them not being completely dependent on you for everything, right? That they can start to have more of that autonomy and there's there's zero downside to that, right? Like, it's not like they're going to be, oh, I don't need a coach anymore, I'll just leave. Some might, but like for the most part, all it does is make the relationship stronger. And that's what it's all about, you know?
Yeah. Well, cause like, that's what a therapist does. And people don't like go to therapy and they're like, thanks for helping. I got it. You know, like, I mean, maybe they do, maybe they're like, I'm sorted. But one of the things I've talked to like my sister about this, because, you know, it's her family, you can feel trusting in that. I'm going to expose her here. No. But like, one of the benefits she mentioned, because I actually don't go to therapy right now. Instead, I'm on antidepressants, which isn't like actually a replacement of therapy. I just am really bad at like scheduling appointments. So I just haven't.
The scheduling, it can be a pain for sure.
Yeah. It's like, oh, you got to do it. It's in 3 months. And then like, you don't know if you like them. And then if you don't like them, you don't really want to open up. And then it's a restart. So I get in my head about that. But if you can find like someone to talk to, whether it is a therapist, and I'm not saying that like I replace a therapist as a coach, but from a therapeutic perspective, one of the benefits of talking about what's going on a regular basis, even if there isn't anything like blowing up in your face in the present moment, is that you can bring up things that you didn't think were important, or that you didn't think that were impacting your day, or your response to people. But they are, because everything impacts your response to other people, or, you know, if you're at your job, like everything does, you know, and you don't necessarily know why or how you've got to that place of responding in that way, but there was something that influenced it, and that behavior was continuously encouraged by either a coping mechanism or by like the leaders that you've been around, you know. And I think in a similar way, we can think about that with lifting. It's like you said, why did that triple out of 7 turn into a triple out of 9, or 5, you know, whatever? Like, why was there such a drastic adjustment? And if the athlete can kind of start doing that self assessment, not like blaming themselves, but like, how am I relating to the world right now? And how is that impacting my session right now? And from my own personal experience as an athlete doing that, I feel like it's just so much more enjoyable, because I put so much less judgment on like any session. Like even today,
yeah. And then it's not, oh, I'm weak today. It's, oh, this explains it. Right. So it's by definition not my fault. It's just the situation.
Yeah. And like, I think that might be going against the grain, because I think a lot of powerlifters like the idea that like they have control over everything, or that it is a very individualistic, you know, relationship to the world that is very common in a lot of, I don't know any like mainstream media, and not to be conspiratorial, but like every problem that the society faces, those who have the ability to help seem to put the blame on the individual. And so if you break that down into like lifting, it's like, oh, you're weak today because you didn't do what was necessary to push through.
Right. And you didn't want it bad enough.
Yeah. And it's like, but that's not even scientific, you know. It's like, it's not even, it's rooted in an ideology instead of reality. And I feel like you are the reason why I brought you on, is because like I haven't seen anyone put together something so helpful and simple without going into the ideological stuff from like a auto-regulation perspective, that is also still like focusing on the system, and not like, if stress is 5, then go down by 2, you know, or whatever. It's like, hey, I feel kind of sore today. Maybe I'll do one last set. Like that chart, I'll post it on the channel. But when I saw that chart, I was like, cool. I'm doing something like similar with my triangle method. It's a little bit less practical right now, and maybe I'll get to a point where it's practical. But how you explained it is very practical, and more or less is what I actually end up doing in the moment. You know what I mean?
For sure. And just to be fair, because someone's going to point this out, I can't take full credit for that. Like the ideas have been out there for a while in bodybuilding, right? Like Mike Israetel talked about that forever ago. And then Steve Hall from Revive Stronger talks about it a lot, and he sort of adapted it from what Mike Israetel sort of introduced. And then all of those parties and other parties who've kind of jumped on board have all kind of evolved it based on their experience. And I'm just doing the same thing, right? Like, I heard the same ideas and I was like, man, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know. And then applying it to myself and other, you know, and clients. And I think powerlifting is slightly different compared to bodybuilding, right? Like there's a lot of crossover, but there's certainly differences. And so that was just sort of my latest iteration of those ideas. And but I certainly don't want to pretend like I completely came up with that on my own.
Well, like, of course, because like we're all influenced by the information that we're exposed to. But I think the differences between bodybuilding and powerlifting create a much more complicated, maybe not, it is complicated, but it's, you can still systematize it in a way that still focuses on the process and not like the individual, like, without making it too sciencey, if that makes sense. Like it is science, but it's not like data, unironically data driven,
Right.
or it is, but it's
For sure.
subjective data, not like quantitative, right?
Yeah.
And the differences are what make a lot of the things that I hear and read about complicated, because, for example, something that influenced a lot of my decisions on like how many sets to do and how hard should the sets be are influenced by Chris Beardsley's work in mechanical tension and hypertrophy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really great. But I also know that expressing strengths isn't simply a mechanistic response. It's influenced by the biopsychosocial model as well.
Yep.
So, but like, I'm okay with that, because I know that if I'm making adjustments on the sets based off of, like, let's say 2 hard sets per set is like a good, or per exercise is a good baseline of like a productive stimulus, I guess, assuming you've recovered. Let's just say that. Then at least I'm covering the bases on a biological level for that practice of the day, that task for the day. But then, like, the nuances of how does the athlete feel in relation to doing instead of 7 at an RPE 8 or triple at an RPE 8, and then how does that impact their momentum leading into this competition? Even if mechanical tension is like similar across for both of them, and hypertrophy hypothetically is similar for both of those sets of 7 or 3, the relationship the athlete has to that set or to the individual moment may impact the whole session and might impact the next session. Because I'm really, like, as an individual, not excited to do singles really ever. Like, I never really want to do a single at an 8. Like, I can do a single at like a 5 or a 6, but that doesn't excite me. So I don't do singles in general, because like people are like, why don't we just reduce the do a single at a 6? But it's like, or I could do a triple at an 8, which is more or less the same, but then I can actually it feels hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where am I going with this? I think the idea is that, yeah, how I relate to that and how another athlete might relate to that completely changes the dynamic between the rest of the program. And if we talk about peaking in general, I mean, mechanical tension has only a small role in like a peak performance, because you are performing, which means you're practicing this very specific skill, or you don't practice it, because the more you practice the very specific skill actually creates this like downward rabbit hole of psychological despair, you know? And it's like, I try to make these not complicated, but like it is, because you can't just simplify it to, oh, high specificity is going to improve your task, because it might actually not, in the event that you relate to that task in a negative way. Right. Or you develop a tolerance and resilience, and then eventually you do make that adaptation. And like, yeah, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, but it's a different cat every time. So I don't know. Continue the analogy.
I agree. I think like the specificity thing is so interesting, right? Because like on paper, that is correct, right? In a vacuum. But like we were just saying, we're not in a vacuum. Every prep's a little bit different. Every whatever's a little bit different. And, you know, sometimes, like you're saying, sometimes it's a psychological thing of high specificity has some negative outcomes, and sometimes it's a physiological thing, right? Like it just beats you up too much, or whatever, you know. So I think that there's always going to be an art to this, right? Like the science is helpful to a degree. And then also, I guess, middle ground, like there's multiple different kinds of data, right? There's the objective stuff, and then there's subjective stuff that's just as, if not more valuable sometimes. And then there's that last little piece, just like, I don't know how to create that outside of reflection on the athlete's part, like inquisitiveness and support from the coach's part, and then that teamwork coming together. Like that collaboration is really, at least in my experience, like that's where all the best peaks have come from, right? Like, because I can't know what it feels like to be that person doing, you know, their squat or whatever that week. Like I can be like, oh, they usually tell me that it feels like this or whatever, but maybe it wasn't like that day, you know? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It's got to be from both parties, I think, which does require more work and more emotional energy, which I get the feeling that you are probably similar to me in this, that emotional energy aspect of it can be exhausting. That, that I think, and not to get on a tangent with this, but like, that's why you can't be working with 100 people at once. If you want to do, you can, if you want to have, a different programming style, whatever, I'm not here to judge that, but like, if you want to do this kind of thing with people, there's you can only do it with so many people at once. Otherwise it's like, you're just not, in integrity with yourself anymore, right? You're losing yourself in the process.
Yeah, that's the huge thing, because it's not sexy to talk about this. It's like,
no.
Wait, we can't simplify into this program style is the best and this one's the worst, which I think, unfortunately, I've had that perspective in the past, like kind of having a lot of judgment on, different styles. But like, I always ask myself, whenever there's like a big powerlifting competition, like let's say Sheffield, what's really interesting to me is what it appears like all of the athletes there, majority of the athletes there are expressing a very high level of strength that appears to be like a pseudo peak, if not a true like peak performance from them. Sure. And then I started asking like, well, why or how is that possible? Because none of them are using emerging strategies. I don't believe. I mean, I'm just saying they aren't. No one's. Mike hasn't coached. RTS didn't coach anyone from Sheffield. That isn't to say that this system doesn't work, but I know that none of them were using like Mike's style of training, which is where I came from. So how is it that they're, peaking if they're not using that like same style, right? Well, sure. Obviously, because many people have peaked at many different times and in different ways, and there's many ways to experience and bring yourself to that point. And I actually had a podcast with Hayden Pritchard. Do you know who that is?
I know the name. I'm not super familiar though.
He actually worked with RTS for like a year. He started working with them right when I left. But he also has done a few studies on like tapering practices for weightlifting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's where I know that name.
Yeah. And so I asked him, I told him all of my thoughts about like the peaking strategies. And then it's like, ultimately, what is the goal of like tapering and how do we experience a peak? And I'll wait to like share what he said, but he did mention just like the basic. It's like, well, the goal of a taper is to reduce fatigue and improve your ability to perform, like, preparedness, as people say it. Mm-hmm. But like, is that not the objective of like every training session? Like, are we ever trying to increase fatigue for the sake of fatigue? Or are we always trying to increase preparedness and mitigate, if not reduce fatigue? You know what I mean? Like
that's interesting. I don't know if I've thought about it in those, like, obviously not for fatigue's sake, right? Like, of course we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
I guess you could make the argument of like, having a phase of training that's more higher volume, more hypertrophy focused, whatever, where the higher fatigue is a trade-off for an investment, that'll pay off down the line. Mm-hmm. But like, I don't know. That's a really interesting way to think about it. Cause you're right. Like, especially when strength is a primary, like, driving motivator for somebody, like, we want to make sure that performance is as high as it can be. It might sometimes be a little bit decreased, but like, we want to do our best with it. So yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah.
I mean, obviously it's just like a hypothesis, but like,
yeah.
So here's another thought I've had recently. It's like, when you take an athlete and you put them through a study or a cohort of athletes, and you put them through like a study to like measure strength and or hypertrophy like outcomes. Correct me if I'm wrong, because honestly, I haven't looked into a lot of like strength focused studies. It seems like a lot of the ones I look at are like, this one led to more muscle mass, but isn't it quite rare for a study to have a cohort of athletes, let's just say they're doing like leg press and they're trying to measure muscle mass gains. And they have some people doing like 2 sets at failure, some for 4 and some for 6 at failure, right? Send sets of 6 sets to failure. You know what I mean? 2, 4, and 6 sets. Let's just say that's
numbers. Yeah.
At failure for each one of the sets. Usually that's how they do them. I don't think they do like RP8 very often, but maybe they do. Anyway, isn't it? I don't know. I can't ask this properly. Isn't it correct that most of these studies result in net positive growth in hypertrophy, like regardless of what they do? Like there's rarely a negative muscle, like negative hypertrophy in these studies. Is that true?
Right. Yeah. Like you might, I mean, they're usually, which is weird to think about, but a lot of times you'll see if they post like the individual subject data, you'll see one or two of them, whatever, actually decrease a little bit, which is weird. We've had that in our lab. Just individual differences, right? They weren't doing enough volume, or they're doing too much volume or whatever for that individual. But anyway, you might see that every once in a while on a per person basis, but on a group level, almost certainly, you're usually going to see, sometimes it's like negligible, but usually everyone's growing to some degree. Some group might grow more than others, but you're not usually seeing people just losing mass like in these large swaths. Like,
like, and I figure if you're more trained and you're doing less volume and you're not recovering and you're not eating enough protein and you're not actually going to failure, I guess, or you're just causing so much muscle damage that you're actually losing, like you can't literally are losing muscle through the damage, which I think is how that works. I don't know. But then if that's the case in general for like, sounds like more like 90% of the people in these types of cohorts, then like every session has the opportunity and a very high likelihood of being a positive, like a net positive session, assuming that we can mitigate fatigue and that the fatigue that's generated from that session isn't so much that you can't train for the rest of the week, or something like that muscle group, because then potentially do start to atrophy. But it also seems like atrophy really only occurs after like 3 weeks or 2 weeks of like actual cessation.
I'll tell you, I'll let you get back on track in 2 seconds here, but let me just say this. Like I had to get hernia surgery at the end of January, right? So I had a month before that, I couldn't train my lower body at all. So that's been basically since Thanksgiving, or since Christmas, I guess. Yeah, since Christmas. Have barely trained my lower body. I've had like a couple sessions here and there doing a little bit. It's been 5 months now, right? I've definitely lost some mass on my legs, but not nearly as much as you would think. And that's with pretty much zero training in 5 months. So like muscle loss absolutely happens, but I think people have this expectation that they're just going to completely shrink to nothing. It's probably not, dude. Like, you're probably fine.
Yeah. And I mean, there are, so this is my kind of current train of thought is like, it is actually very difficult to have a training session that you actually push your muscle circa RP 7 to 10 even, for even just like one set, and it results in like a reduction in muscle mass. It might result in higher fatigue because you haven't recovered because you're training one muscle group every single day for like all week. But that's where like my thought is, it's like if our goal overall is to increase performance and mitigate, if not reduce fatigue, then like even in a phase where we're trying to like accumulate a lot of stress, the goal isn't the stress. The goal is the increase in performance or the elevated like hypertrophy adaptation. But hypertrophy is negatively impacted by fatigue, at least from what I understand in terms of like motor unit recruitment, achieving enough mechanical tension to stimulate further growth. If like you're limited by like pain or a reduction in motivation or fatigue, that is going to impact the benefit of that entire stimulus, leading to a more rapid deload than necessary, which again probably won't hurt, but it would be like a hindrance towards, I mean, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but it probably would be like a hindrance towards further growth, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would just be less productive weeks in the year, right? Like, not that you don't, I think that you can still grow a little bit during deload weeks, but certainly less than a normal week, right? So if we're doing that every 3 weeks instead of every 8 weeks, like it's a lot more of those weeks, you know?
Yeah. And so it's like, I might have the answer already, but it seems to be that everyone wants to get the most out of every session, but they don't have the information necessary to get the most, because sometimes getting the most, having a productive session, is doing less. right?
Yes.
Because if fatigue is kind of this like fatigue, pain, motivation, et cetera, all these variables that impact motor unit recruitment and tension applied and force,
Mhm.
you know, if those variables are considered, then getting the most of that in a session is bringing even more awareness to those variables and then making a decision from there. At least that's, again, my working, ever expanding hypothesis on like how to do this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's all about your perspective, right? Like, is your perspective limited to just this training session, or is it the whole? Because then the conclusion is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the most important thing. I think, at least, of that, what you just went through is like that we can do what we do today. Like, that's fine. But what about what's going to happen tomorrow? How are we going to feel on Wednesday when we need to squat again? How are we going to whatever? Now, obviously, you could just push that to Thursday if you're super fatigued, whatever. But like, the more we can kind of set ourselves up for success from a general structure standpoint, I think is helpful. And then, like we said earlier, use, all these other indicators and subjective feelings and whatnot to adjust here and there. But yeah, man, we got to keep that whole overall week, month, training block, whatever, kind of in mind. And like, because sometimes it pays off. Dude, I've had some people where we've had way better success, like really pacing ourselves the first couple weeks, and then we get after it in that last week, right? We kind of strike there at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas other people, it's a much more stable, consistent thing, right? Like, it just, I don't know, it just depends. But like, I think some people can get away with not thinking about that too much. Yeah. I think I'm one of those people. I recover from anything. It's weird. It makes no sense.
Oh, really?
Like, quick anecdote just to illustrate my point. So this was back in the end of 2019 into the beginning of 2020. I was doing a bodybuilding prep that I wasn't able to get on stage because we all know what happened in early 2020 and everything gets canceled. So I was like, all right, we'll call it there. But during this process, I normally, like right now I weigh like 195 or something. Normally I'm somewhere in that, 180 to 200, whatever range. I weighed 160 pounds at the time, right? Very lean, veins in my abs, right? The whole thing. Still progressing almost every lift every week. I was doing the most volume I've ever done in my life. Everything was like 0 to 1 RIR, except like some leg stuff was probably more like 2 or 3 if I'm being really honest. But like, it made zero sense why I shouldn't just be thrashed at that point, right? But I was still progressing. I was like, this is stupid. I don't get it. Yeah. But like, most people I don't think are like that. And they need to really, like, I could get away with, thinking a little bit less in that context, right? Like, I don't need to worry so much about next week because I'll probably be fine. Whereas I think a lot of people do need to think about that a lot more, especially powerlifting, right? When you have the heavy loads, like, you just got to be much more careful is not the right word, but you know what I mean? Well,
and that's a great point that illustrates the differences, because the task of squatting to depth with the load on your back, maintaining balance and maintaining position and confidence, and then driving through that sticking point, and then also you're in front of a bunch of people doing it, like that's what you're preparing for. Mm-hmm. You better have a lot of belief in yourself once you show up on the platform, and then like that's where insert psychological, like what's the phrase, like quote, like these like motivational quotes actually kind of play a role. I mean, not necessarily like you should have that motivational quote in your head, but it's like the belief that you have in yourself can really impact the outcome. Even if it's not the outcome that your belief, like, ultimately, for example, I thought in my head, I could squat 500 pounds at my meet. None of my data really indicated that. But in my head, I'm like, I don't know, man. I mean, I train at home in my basement in my training, right here, mostly. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I go to the gym, but mostly I train here. The equipment is like fine, but it also, I'm like squatting like on a platform. It's kind of bouncy. It feels a little bit slanted because of the bounce. Mm-hmm. It also all feels heavier because every time I use kilo plates, like it feels a lot more calm, or like it feels lighter and I can do more. Also, I don't train in front of people, and I know that I benefit a lot from training in front of like a crowd. Like I like the energy, I like the excitement, I like the nerves that I get that I can't like reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
With bodybuilding, I mean, that's similar, but it's in the posing, not in like the the training. So yeah, you can go deep into those factors. And one of the reasons why I believe that the peaking is more of a product of the environment, the psychology, and the biology, in that if we can just prevent the biology from getting in the way of itself, you're probably going to peak, like just because you have a competition. If you're a type of person that likes performing in front of people, you've practiced the movements enough that, you know, pushing the single out of 10 on these lifts, you're skillful enough to just get in the flow, and you have enough caffeine, you know, to like get yourself hyped. Like as long as you're not training at that level every single session, then the difference between what you're doing right now and what you could do is probably a lot greater. And that's another reason why I don't like doing singles, because I don't like feeling like what I'm doing right now and what I'm going to do at my meet is like this. I like this idea of like, ooh, what if I could squat 30 kilos more than ever? You know, that gets me hyped, because unlike you, I get fatigued from everything like easily. So I know that about myself, and I know that my capacity for expressing strength kind of on the fly is much higher. But if I'm constantly like getting myself closer to that peak expression of strength, motivation drops, fatigue increases, like psychological fatigue increases, my joints start to feel a little bit more beat up. Even if I do like 1 or 2 singles, you know, that bothers me for some reason. I have a lot of these like nagging aches and stuff that I don't feel with even a double or a triple at an apron. For some reason, that 90 to 93% absolute intensity, even if technically the central and peripheral stress is lower, seems to increase my pain sensitivity, which then prevents me from, you know, expressing strength in the platform. So I'm like, the way I think about my own training is like I'm pacing my performance so that the risk factor involved with pushing is only high when it has to be, you know? So that way I can stay in this like zone of like flow, and then I can jump into that like high arousal, high risk state on meet week and meet day. Whereas other athletes, like I just started working with someone and they're like, no, I love singles. I love that. I love the proximity of capability being, you know, similar across sessions.
Yeah. I mean, it's just another example of how different people can be so different, you know, like for your situation, that makes perfect sense, right? Like, I think that is the right thing to do. I was somebody, cause I powerlifted for like 4 or 5 years before. Now I'm doing more bodybuilding stuff, but, I was one of you guys at some point, you know, but I got a lot out of singles because I would get very anxious about doing singles. So for me to do it, it helped me build confidence with it. And then when I got to a meet, it wasn't as scary. I felt I could predict my performance a little bit better. So my attempt selection, I felt more comfortable with, that kind of stuff. Right. So it's just, I mean, it's like literally everything we're talking about here, right? Everyone's different, and it's all about just learning how somebody ticks and trying to, you know, push the right buttons at the right times, and, you know, not overstep certain things, even if on paper it would make sense. Like sometimes you got to throw that away, you know, and go with like what ultimately leads to the outcome is what we want. It doesn't matter if it makes sense or not. If it leads to better results, that's what it's all about, you know? So.
Oh man, I wish I had you for longer, but there's a post that I saw about how actually the more important thing is the rationale behind it, and the outcome is not irrelevant, but not a way to decide if it was a good decision. And I don't want to like straw man, but like there are a lot of things that I agree about that. And that like in the moment you made a decision based on the information you had. So if the decision was made with enough information, and like you mutually agreed with the athlete that like the decision was made, and then whatever happens, like I'm much more comfortable with that. But one of the things that I disagree, or it wasn't communicated in the post, and if you know about it, you know about it. I don't really feel like calling anyone out. It wasn't highlighting the fact that the athlete has the ability to influence that decision. Meaning, it's not about the coach. Like, yeah, you might give all of the credit, like all of the responsibility on the coach, right? Like I do that with my beginner athletes. But as the competition increases and the athlete becomes more aware of what they're capable of, why not get more of their input right after the lift? You know, like maybe not like, hey, how did that feel? Are you fucking ready? Are you anxious? Blah, blah, blah. But like this or this, what are you feeling? Where are you leaning towards? And then if they need more information to help guide that choice, for us to guide that choice together, I'll do it. But I think at like the IPF world level, a lot of coaches think that they've got to like know everything about the lifter before they even show up. And it's like, but even in the meet, these sensations impact the next decision. You know, it's not just bar speed. I mean, I wanted 500 at my meet, but I had never experienced the insane quality of an Alico competition bar before. And as a result, the rotational like force, or what, like what do they call that? When you like spin the plates really easily on the bar.
I don't know the word either, but I know what you mean.
Yeah. That's not like my bar goes like maybe like this, like maybe it'll move like this, right? That bar, you can just touch it and it go, right? So I wasn't used to that feeling at the bottom. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go to 220 instead of 227.5. I still missed 220, but I wasn't like, oh, I missed. I was like, yeah, makes sense. Like I wasn't prepared. Like it's fine. Like I really wanted 220, but in the moment I'm like, well, I'm not used to a lot of these things that I, thought I would be, because I train with a rusty Ohio power bar that I haven't cleaned since I bought it. Like,
nice.
And I don't, so it's like, again, the overall reason for, I think, both of us being really interested in this is like that acceptance of the kind of the moment, acceptance of the decision, acceptance of your experience. And that leads to like a lot of, I think, like self, like love and appreciation for the fact that you did anything, and the fact that you actually did follow your instinct. And then the one thing I want to like lead off, or maybe this isn't the end, but this idea of like, it depends, or like, it depends. So whatever, but it's like, I think this gives us an answer to like, what does it actually depend on? Like not an answer, but a process to actually answer what it depends on. Because I think earlier in my coaching career, it's like, oh, it depends on their response. Like, but also the why of the response could help us improve the actual response, and that has given me so much more confidence, even if there's still uncertainty in the response, that the decision that I'm making with the athlete is the right one, again, with the information we have. But then also, if it isn't going the right way, we both have that information to shift into a better decision.
Yeah, that's cool. I think that's like right in line with sort of how I've been thinking about some things lately, of being like with when I'm writing a program or when I'm updating it for next week or whatever, I'm not after the 3 sets of 5 at 200 kilos or whatever the X's and O's are. I don't care about that at all. I'm after the stimulus and the effect, but those things are not, the stimulus doesn't come from the X's and O's only, right? It comes from that, but it's in the context of all this other stuff that's going on. So like, who's to say that, the stimulus from that protocol wouldn't be the same as a stimulus from a slightly different protocol if the other context was different, right? Like, so it's so hard for me to not feel like things need to be fluid. And that doesn't necessarily, like, I don't think that I personally would feel comfortable with like, today we're doing 5 sets, next week we're going to do 1, week after that we're going to do 10 because you felt great, and now you're blown to bits, so now we're going to do 1 set the next. Like, I don't know how I feel about that, but I think having some degree of fluidity and the ability to like have all that context in mind, and I think that is like, I am fully on video check-ins now. I'm not gonna, everyone has their method, right? Any coach out there does what they do because it works best for them and, helps their clients the best, whatever. That's been super helpful for me because it immediately, it's almost an automatic thing for them to give me that kind of feedback. Cause like, if not, what else are we going to talk about? Like you can only say my squat went great. Like, there's only so much to talk about, but if they're already talking to a camera and it feels like you're talking to somebody else, it's like people just automatically do it, and it's invaluable, right? Like that that it's such an integral part in the week to week adjustments. And like without, like, no coach can do that, right? We can't just predict, like if everything is perfectly stable, nutrition, sleep, stress, everything, then we can predict things reasonably well. It still won't be perfect, but pretty good. But like, man, especially for people who like super busy lifestyle, super stressful lifestyle, maybe there's like some mental health considerations going on, maybe there's whatever, right? We have, like, there's no other option, in my opinion, right? Especially if we want to get the best program that we can. Like if that's not the concern, then cool, right? But if we're trying to really hone in on things, like there's no way around it. We got to get that feedback.
Yeah. I think that's a really good place for us to kind of wrap up. I wanted to allow you an opportunity to plug the Infinity programs, because from what I've like seen, it sounds like you're actually, you just tell me what it is, because I don't want to put any words in your mouth.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you, by the way. But yeah, dude, Infinity is super cool. It's sort of the newest, very revamped version of what we've had previously that was like called the DDSIP. It was individualized programming, right? It was a step down. It's somewhere between templates and coaching, was where it sort of originally was. And it was sort of this method of, you fill out this form and you get based on all these different inputs, a program that's like as individualized as it can be on a first glance, right? And you go through it, and then over time it adapts, and each training block that you do gets more and more individualized. This is just that on steroids, right? So it's just completely revamped visually, and all the processes and everything. There's a lot of new like data analytic tools in there. There's just anything you can think of that could potentially be individualized, it's built into there somehow, right? So it's super cool. We've had a really good response from it so far. Very proud of it. It's awesome, man. So if anyone's interested in it, the goal with it is to try to get as close to coaching as we can, because nothing will ever be the same as actual coaching, right? Like we can't have that one-on-one human element, but get as close as we can with, a much lower price, obviously, right? So
increasing that accessibility. Cool. Yeah. Because like we said, we can only work, like I think my cap could be 20 lifters with this approach, maybe 30, if I'm, cutting out other aspects of my life. Yeah. So, I feel you.
Yeah. It's tough, man. It's like, I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to do it during a PhD, bro. Like you're trying to really keep a cap on it at that point. But even once that's done, like you still like, there's a limit, so being able to help more people get good programming is always a useful thing.
Yeah. Cool, Jake. Well, I will end that here. Anyone that's interested in more of the podcast or would like it to grow, just share this with your friends. I think this would be interesting. I didn't ever introduce Jake, but I probably will in the beginning. datadrivenstrength.com. Or if you're interested in working with me and the coaches of our team, I think we have similar interests. That's why we had Data Driven on now twice. So that's cool. 3 times technically, because we split up the first podcast. Zalstrength.com, and see you guys in the next one.